evening. I'm Kevin T. Sabu and I'll be a moderator for today. Thank you for joining with us tonight. We are glad that you are part of our webinar series. Nauticum's Event Management Private Limited is a student-led initiative run by a team of students from various universities across various nations. And we are a student-led initiative that is based upon various universities in Australia, Canada, India, Philippines, UK, and USA to facilitate dialogue on some of the most important questions that third world is faced with right now. The vision behind the Secret of the Circle webinar series is to set up a deliberative space that will enable conversations to occur without a power hierarchy, offering space for different voices to be heard, simulating in the form of a circle that stands for unity, harmony, and equal consideration of all participants. We believe that the platform will create a free flow of ideas that will allow the youth to ask relevant questions and embark on a solution-seeking journey. Before we start the session, there are a few points for you to keep in mind. Please keep your microphone off for the entire duration of the webinar so as to not disrupt the proceedings. You may turn your video on or off as per your convenience. There will be two different parts of the session. Firstly, it will be the speaker session on the topic, and then there will be a question and answer session at the end. For the question and answer session, which will be at the end of the webinar, if you have a question, please raise your hands on Zoom. The moderator will then pick 5 participants at random from those who have raised their hands for the speaker to answer. You will be allowed to unmute your microphone by the moderator only during this time to facilitate better discussion. Introduce yourself first and then ask the question to Sir. I hand over the stage now to Meenakshi for the introduction. We will now officially start the session. Meenakshi,
Thank you, Kevin. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session of the Secret of the Circle webinar series, an event organized by Nauticum's Event Management, which is a student-led initiative that aims at promoting awareness about world issues in the youth. Our flagship event is the Global Youth Colloquium, Model United Nations, also known as the GYCMUN. This webinar series aims at keeping the youth in par with the happenings of the world and encourages them to share their thoughts about the same. We decided to name this series The Secret of the Circle to portray the discussions here occur without a power hierarchy, symbolizing a circle which represents unity, harmony, and equal consideration of all its participants. Today's webinar is on the topic Repression of the Voice of Dissent. With the same, we are pleased to have with us an Indian political theorist, social activist, a prolific writer, and an activist for Dalit rights, Mr. Kanta Elia Shepherd, joining us today in this session. His renowned works are both in English as well as Telugu. He retired as the director of the Center for Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy at the Maulana Azad National Urdu University at Hyderabad. He is the chairman of Telangana Mass and Social Organizations that work for English medium education. He has played a very pivotal role in Dalit Bahujan and civil liberties movement in India. He is the recipient of the Mahatma Jyotirao Phule Award in 2000. His paper, Experience as Framework of Debate, has appeared in Economic and Political Weekly, has set up new terms for debate on the reservation policy during the anti-Mandal struggle in the 1990s. His various works have also been published in major national English dailies like The Hindu, etc. Sir is widely acclaimed and known for his firebrand Dalit Bahujan writings, such as Why I Am Not a Hindu, a Shudra critic of Hindutva policy, culture, and political economy, God as political philosopher, Buddha's challenge to Brahmanism, Buffalo nationalism, a critique of spiritual fascism, etc. On behalf of the entire Nauticum's team, I would like to welcome you, sir, to this session, and I would like to hereby give you the floor for your address. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this webinar that brought together several students from 8 universities across several countries. And it is important that you have chosen a very significant topic, that what is happening to dissent in India and across the world. in the recent past, particularly ever since the 21st century entered, and then the globe began to shape up a new mode of life with highly advanced technologies and a lot of foreign travels from one country to other, and capitalism developing to a stage of post-capital where communications, travel, and the educational avenues across the world began to expand. But at the same time, there has been a rise of right-wing forces in the whole of the world. Now, the rise of the right wing is a negation of the democratic structures that emerged over a period of time, more particularly after World War II, that democracy as institutions have expanded, constitutionalism has also expanded, the colonial administrations have withdrawn, and there began what we call post-colonial world, with democracy as the key administrative, constitutional and governing force. Now, from end of Second World War II, the Cold War period, from Cold War to the present, there is a significant shift in the global democratic discourses. From World War II, the defeat of fascism, where in the name of nationalism, took place in a massive destruction of human resources, national resources, European economies, even the whole of the world was affected with World War II. But subsequently, the humanity realized that unless the globe enters into the phase of massive production with an idea of dignity of labor, with an idea of advanced technology, with an idea of exchange of global knowledges, the future of the world would be difficult. Because in this process, two types of non-monarchical systems emerged in the world. One is democracy, the other one is socialist systems. Starting with Soviet Union, then China, then East European countries, and Korea, some of the Eastern Buddhist countries went into the socialist phase. Now there was a clash between democratic systems and the socialist systems. The clash was the democratic systems wanted free market, open societies, open electoral systems, multi-party discourses, and the freedom of expression without any controls were supposed to be the hallmark of democracy. On the other hand, socialist systems that emerged starting with Soviet Union and then later on China and East European countries, parts of the Latin American countries. They chose one party after revolutions, and there was a constitution. But building up iron-curtained economies under the principle of dictatorship of proletariat has not much scope for freedom of speech. Therefore, over a period of time, by 1970s, the world witnessed that the socialist systems would have more difficulty in surviving than in democratic systems. And by 1990, socialism entered into a major crisis. And democracies expanded, and the freedom of expression notion, freedom of expression has two contexts. Because the whole issue of dissent and opposition to free speech has two dimensions. One, the political expression, the constitutional rights that were guaranteed in each country need to be used by various layers of societies. The other one is the right to religion question. Because what happened in the early 21st century, there was a sort of clash of religious cultures, though some social scientists are saying that it was a clash of civilizations between the Islamic world on the one side and the Euro-American Christian world on the other. The rest of the world getting divided between these two camps was becoming more and more sharp. 9/11 attack on America and the rise of terrorism in Muslim countries and the global opposition to terrorist practices. But this led to another issue of the right to religion. Whether it is in socialist systems or in democracies or in Muslim world or in Euro-American countries, whether the right to religion to practice as people wanted with the freedom that religion requires is allowed or not. Now, in countries like India, the right to religion has become more and more problematic with the rise of Hindutva nationalism and the Hindutva nationalism coming to power in 1999. Similarly, in Muslim world, democracy did not survive. Hardly there were democratic systems. Pakistan experimented. Countries like Indonesia have been consistently trying. Malaysia, Singapore are still practicing, but most of the Muslim countries were, going back and forth between dictatorship and democracy and so on. Even Turkey entered into crisis. The Soviet system collapsed and free market began to take place there also. So the right to democratic expression, the right to religion in the socialist countries came to fore, and a lot of struggles. Even in China, free market got opened up with Deng Xiaoping coming into picture. And then, though China has one-party system, political stability is, in a way, sustained, but the democratic rights of people, the freedoms of people are a problem. The right to religion is a problem. So, in one sense or the other, in socialist countries, in democratic countries like India, in Muslim countries, even in the Western, what we call Christian democratic systems, there arose the issue of race, racial equality, and complete freedoms, economic equality, because the expansion of markets, advanced capitalism has created complete imbalance in the economic structure. Just few hundred families started controlling entire markets across the world. If you take India, for example, just 10-12 families control almost 50 to 60% of Indian wealth. The Ambanis, Adanis, Vedanta, and mostly Banias and Kayasthas, Khatris, Brahmins in the software. But the productive masses, the Shudras, the Dalits, the Adivasis, and the women, they have not much role in education. And what happened in a country like India is the language policy hit very hard the rural masses, the Dalits, the Adivasis, the Shudras, who were working in the agrarian fields, could not get English medium education on par with the Brahmins, Banias, Kayasthas, Khatris, and who became industrialists, who became English educated, who settled in different parts of the world. So the huge gap emerged in India. Similarly, in the Muslim world, enormous economic gap. There was no open debate on the economic equality, and women's rights were major problem. Right to education of women in the equal mode was a big problem in many countries, mostly in the Muslim world, 56 countries. So they started dissent in those countries also. If many of you must have been very young kids, or some of you by 2010, when there was Arab Spring, thousands of Muslim women came out into the streets asking for democracy, asking for abolition of monarchies, and several brutal rulers were overthrown, and new systems could not settle down. And meanwhile, because of the 9/11 factor, American imperial operations expanded into the Asian countries. Iraq became an issue. So it is in this context democracies began to be intervened by religious authorities. Secular notion across the world began to suffer, and freedoms and free markets were there, but once the mall market system came into the third world, massive economic imbalances, poverty, unemployment, lack of globally communicable language education, universities were inadequate. It were in this situation, lot of struggles across the world started. Of course, in China, this whole question of open economy, the whole question of China competing with America on many global markets, and Europe becoming a lesser power in the recent past. And it is in this context, unfortunately, a lot of natural calamities happened, but more than anything, Corona pandemic hit the whole world and all economies are collapsed, and the rights of the people are being crushed because there is no right to protest now. You can't protest because the right to protest is taken away by Corona pandemic. Public gatherings are not possible. So those right-wing regimes which would like to impose more and more right-wing policies on the farmers, on the students, on the religious minorities, on the freedoms of women, they are imposing very harsh laws. For example, the farmers' laws, agricultural laws that Indian government made recently, and in the context of India and China entering into a kind of war, there seems to emerge a massive economic crisis because of the COVID, because of huge lockdowns without proper planning. And when economies like America, Europe are suffering, China started using its leverage across the world. So India, for example, the entire Indian economy in a way collapsed. A non-planned lockdown and the mass food question, the mass labor, merely 40 crore people, 400 million people were labor in the urban areas who migrated from rural areas in several sectors. When sudden lockdown with hardly 8 hours notice, the entire system collapsed and there was no possibility of protest. Lockdowns may be necessary as scientists suggested, but they need to be given time. People need to travel back to their parents, back to their children, and homeless across the world have really suffered, and hundreds, thousands, in fact, thousands and thousands across the world died of starvation, homelessness in the pandemic situation. So pandemic has become a source of using authoritarian powers over masses. For example, universities, administrative units are not functioning. Fee structures are not properly being monitored. Schools and colleges are not working. And then new technologies that emerged that were supposed to be used by home-based education, online education. But in a country like India, or even in Muslim world, in African countries, the poorest of the poor who don't have the sophisticated modern cell phones, how do they learn? So suddenly their hope got dismantled. Thanks to agrarian masses who are struggling to produce the food. Take, for example, in India, the food producers were condemned historically that they were polluted. And meanwhile, the right-wing regime in India has created food crisis through the laws of cow ban and beef ban laws. So India, 60% of Indians live with meat, fish, whatever meat they like. Because human beings were never just vegetarians like a section of animals, nor were they meatarians like a section of another animals like tiger or lion or things like that. They were not cows and buffaloes or deers or sheep and goat to eat only vegetables to live, or they were not lions and tigers. They eat both. That's how the Indian civilization from the days of Harappan city civilization building came to where we are today. Now the right-wing regime with an unusual culture of vegetarianism, two family, caste, religious vegetarian forces called the Brahminic vegetarianists and the Jains, who never worked in the agrarian fields, in production, in denuding forests, in claiming land resources for agricultural developments. So unless you eat meat food and use your muscle power, you can't produce food, you can't break stones, you can't feed cattle all along the day. So they started imposing their food culture on nature. So, this kind of policies could be more rigorously implemented during COVID kind of times. But COVID has shown that pure vegetarianism cannot have enough immunity levels for children, for old, for weak, diseased. So masses after masses began to suffer. So we evolved wrong policies of food cultures, and they were linked up to divinities. And in other countries, destroying environment for unnecessary consumption happened. Now, human beings don't need, I was studying from the days of civilization beginning in India, Indus Valley civilization, and in Israel, Jericho, and in China, Kino city building. And in those, from there to Buddhism, to rise of Christianity, to modern economies and political systems, human beings need to consume as much as they need to survive, and survival of all is important. So the religious schools that believed that God created some people superior and others inferior or untouchables. For example, in Hinduism, they promoted a theory that God created Brahmins from head, Kshatriyas from shoulders, Vaishyas from thighs, Shudras from feet, untouchables were not created. So these theories were not divine theories. So such theories were imposed, and wrong religious. In Islamic countries, women don't have the right to go and work with other families' men with free access of open space. Now this is not correct. Unless you use man-woman physical potential, the labor power, you cannot produce food resource for all human beings to live on equal plane. So even in West, the battles went on between the blacks and the whites for equality. For man in America, even now, a woman cannot become president because the male chauvinist culture still is very strong there. Somehow we overcame that. Indira Gandhi became prime minister, and in Asian continent, many women prime ministers and presidents have come up. That's one good situation, but women's education, women's right to control their own body, women's right to equality in marriage, these are still global problems. So unless the universities work out new methodologies around human equality of social, economic, political, and spiritual, unless universities develop syllabus around dignity of labor. For example, in India, shoemaking is condemned as worthless, as untouchable. Pot making is seen as barbaric. Tilling the land is seen as uncivilized and undivine. So how do people live? Tillers cannot become priests in the temple, even though they claim they are Hindu. So there are many religions which do not give equality to either one section or to women. Women cannot run religious institutions even now. In Islam, that is still a major problem. Therefore, I have a feeling that we need to, the young students of all these different universities, countries, must focus on 2-3 things. One, whether a nation chooses democracy or socialism, there is scope for choice, but there is no scope for dictatorship. Universities must come out with a lot of theoretical writing on opposing dictatorships and family rules, hereditary rules, in all countries where they exist. Second, dignity of labor. If we don't do massive research on the human need to work with nature, whether one believes in religion or not, whether one believes in this religion or that religion, dignity of labor has to be central in human education, child education. For example, in India, a boy is never taught to clean the house, wash the clothes, wash the vessels, and a girl is never taught to go to market, be on par with male children. Now this is there even in China. So far, China did not have a single woman president of the nation, chairman of the nation. Why? If communism gives better life, equality, then why in China or in Russia or in any socialist country, in communist parties of India, there is no such women equal status. So far, no communist party could make women their head secretaries. Or a Dalit, Adivasi could not become CPM party general secretary. Now these are major problems. BJP did not allow a woman to become president of the party or prime minister. So, and Muslim world has a huge problem with the women's seat. Now, whatever their religious texts say, universities must focus on spiritual democracy as a center of study. Because political democracies emerge from the notion of spiritual democracy. What is the basis of spiritual democracy? The idea of spiritual democracy came into the human mind with the fundamental principle that God created all human beings equal, men and women also equal. This is not theorized very much in the universities. Religion was relegated to theology, in Christianity, pastors, in Islam, mullahs, in Hinduism, Brahmin temple, priests, and in Buddhism, monks. The Buddhist monks don't allow women to become monks now. You know, I did my PhD on Gautam Buddha's political thought. In his time, during 6th century BC, there were women monks. Prostitutes joined Buddhist sanghas, Amrapali, Sumangala. They became leaders. So in modern Buddhism, I don't see women monks taking major Buddhist priestly roles, no. Now, universities working in different countries must go beyond the present interpretations of religion. Whatever the religion, we should not really bind ourselves to that. You know, Hegel, before he became a great philosopher of the world and discovered the theory of thesis, antithesis and synthesis, he wanted to become a pastor, a priest in the church. He studied the life of Jesus and wrote his biography. All of you must read Hegel's biography of Jesus Christ. How he interpreted Jesus. How he interpreted Jesus as a spiritual liberator of the Gentiles who were like Shudras in India, the Samaritans who were like Dalits in Israel, and the women, even the prostitutes, even the lepers, even those women who were condemned. He brought them together into his own fold and began to liberate by saying that God created all of them equal. So in Islamic society, there is a need for radical reinterpretation. In Hinduism, of course, it has no structural theoretical formulas, and I've been writing a lot, and people don't engage in the university. JNU, Delhi University, Hyderabad University, and by and large, lawyers, judges, professors don't engage with the idea of spiritual justice, the idea of spiritual democracy. See, if a country like India does not believe that cow and buffalo are equal animals, simply because buffalo is a black animal, even though it gives more milk than cow, and cow is a white animal, which came along with Aryans as a food animal to them. So all universities treat cow as sacred. I mean, they never talk about buffalo in this country. Intellectuals, Gandhi to JNU professors to Delhi University, they have never written a single essay on buffalo. I wrote a book on buffalo nationalism. I'm first generation educated from a shepherd community where my parents were illiterates for centuries, generations. So the question, how did I do it? I did that because I learned English. I understood the world differently than what Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, Hindi, or even Sanskrit or Persian or Urdu languages could give that sense of freedom and knowledge. Therefore, I would appeal to all young scholars. The question of production must become central to your studies. You must go to villages. Villages are centers of philosophy, centers of production, centers of interpretative knowledge. Villages are key of producing technologies. Not only in India, at many places. I'll just sum up and then we can go for question answer session. So what I'm saying is these university students like you have to take up research and dialogue on multi-dimensional, what we call interdisciplinary areas. So, but most of you who came from India or any other third world country like, maybe Bangladesh, Pakistan or whatever, we need to develop research areas around the idea of spiritual democracy and idea of dignity of labor and the idea of human equality, and then the right to dissent with the authorities, whatever the level of authority it could be. Because after all, new ideas can come up only when you disagree with somebody and challenge somebody. A student can disagree with the supervisor. A supervisor can disagree with the student and yet can continue to do research with such teacher. So only when this keeps happening, rigorous reading and visiting villages, studying the village civilizations and cultures, we can construct new knowledge to change, and the right-wing regimes will have to be transformed. And the left-wing regimes which do not allow democratic discourses also will have to transform. And the religious regimes will have to transform. So there is a need for a global new phase of human development and educational understanding and resource building. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. We can have discussion.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking time from your busy schedule.
Speak slightly louder. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking time from your busy schedule to talk to us on repression of the voice of dissent. It was definitely an informative session. I'm sure that we all have learned something and unlearned at least some misconceptions. With this end of the talk, I'm sure there are a lot of intriguing questions that are there in everyone's minds. So without any further delay, we shall now move on to the question and answer session. If you have a question, please raise your hands on the Zoom Cloud meeting. Please raise your hand and a participant will be chosen by the moderator at random from whoever has raised their hands to ask the question to the speaker. You will be allowed to unmute your microphone by the moderator only during this time to facilitate better discussion. Introduce yourself first and your university before asking a question. Follow the following steps to raise your hand in Zoom Cloud meeting. Firstly, during a meeting, click on the icon labeled participants at the bottom center of the PC or Mac screen. Then, at the end of the bottom of the window, on the right hand side of the screen, please click the button labeled Raise Hand. Your digital hand is now raised. Lower it by clicking the same button now labeled Lower Hand. Or if you're using a mobile device, please simply tap raise hand by bottom left corner of the screen. The hand icon will turn blue and then text below will switch to say lower hand while your hand is raised. With this, we'll now move on to the question answer session. So can we start the question answer session?
Yeah.
First question from Regula VV. Madam, please ask your question.
Yeah, Rajula, start.
Hello. Sir, I'm from Kerala. I'm Regula, Dr. Regula.
Okay.
And thank you for your energizing speech. I have been doing my research for the last 7 years among scheduled tribe students. And my question is related to that, sir. I have completed my study and I was trying to make use of that content benefiting to the students. But I'm helpless. My theme is I have taken cartoon icons, the primitive tribal groups, and I'm an English teacher and I tried to make an e-content and which is using their folklores, their myth, their dialect, their culture, their geographical areas, etc. And I tried to make a content based on their context. And unfortunately, I could not see what the text they are studying now is based on SCERT Kerala.
Okay.
Yes, it is not making any kind of connection with their context.
No, what happens, Regula, is that when you are studying tribal culture, folklore, and maybe their religious rituals, and construct a theoretical formula out of that, the problem you have is lack of coherent literature on that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so you need to cull out something from their dialogues, your discussions with them. But even there, they don't give you any coherent argument. So when you try to write a thesis on such things, because thesis needs a sort of sophisticated analysis and footnoting, so on and so forth. What I would suggest is, when you are doing PhD work,
sir, it's already over.
Okay, even if you have done it, then how do you apply it to the concrete condition? Then how do you relate it to literary sources? Then, since you are an English teacher, you should be able to write a better novel than a thesis on their life. You know, pick up one or two people whom you met as activists, militant, or very dynamic, and make a protagonist out of them, and then write a novel about their culture, civilization, or life, so on. That would be really connecting. If not today, tomorrow, it will be very useful.
Okay, sir, I will try. So my query was that I would like to make use of my developed e-content useful for these cartoon icon students. And I have approached our State Council of Education here, and they said that the government is going to end their term, and so there is no project for this. But I don't want to make the thesis inside a library. I just wanted to give them, and this is already happens in many countries like Nepal or even in our other states, but Kerala is not ready to accept it, I think. So I just want to suggestion.
See, these are the institutional problems. See, each university or each institution has its own mechanism, but mostly they are still very traditional. Any new interpretation, new idea, new exposition, old people are not willing to accept. So you have to try that in the popular domain and impress the institutions through the popular. Me, for example, where I wrote Why I Am Not a Hindu.
Yes, sir.
Nobody was willing to accept that book in the universities in the beginning. But now it is a text studied across the world in English departments, in sociology, in history too. So you need to put out and then raise a debate, which takes quite a bit of your energy. But over a period of time, you will learn that, okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, next.
Thank you, sir. Next question was sent to us on chat by Ms. Naina from Tata School of Artists, Mumbai. The question is, when giving importance to the English language education for Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi people, are we not undermining the importance of vernacular languages?
No, what you have to understand is, language is an instrument of life, power. So, my understanding is, any advancing major language is likely to kill the small languages. And the elite in those societies will use developed language for their advantage and keep on building a sentiment around the vernacular. Now, why should tribals or Dalits or backward classes or the Shudras who live in agrarian sector sacrifice their development, their connectivity, their international linkages for the sake of vernacular sentiment? After all, Malayalam, Telugu, Tamil, Hindi, they are regional languages. Their vocabulary is very small. Their scientific base is weak. So English will certainly look at Tamil Nadu. All Tamil Brahmins and Bengal Brahmins, their mother tongue was Sanskrit. They gave it up. They became English educated. They are the ones who get Nobel Prizes now. They go and live all over the world. And they get Bharat Ratnas. But what about the food producers? So my feeling is India has to, all Indian children should learn two languages. One, the English language as a national language and global language with number one priority, and their regional language as second language for using at home in the market. But never counterpose English to the vernacular, the mother tongue. This is all rubbish to think. Because this is what the deceptive intellectual gangs have imposed on us. So the lower castes, the tribals, how long tribals should live in tribal or forest areas without knowing English? Why should they? If that is the case, Brahmins would have lived in Sanskrit. But they learned Persian when Muslims were ruling, when it was a national language. Then when British came, they learned English and they are now ruling the world. Kamala Harris, her mother, goes from here, and then now because of English, she is becoming vice president. How can you deny such global opportunity to the tribals, Adivasis, Dalits? So my feeling is, this language sentiment you all should give. English is Indian, like Tamil, Malayalam, or Sanskrit, any other language, because it lived for 203 years now.
Thank you. Next question is from Sanjay R. Sanjay R, please ask your question.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, good evening. This is Sanjay R. I am from Tata Institute of Social Science.
Yeah.
I'm a bachelor student. Sir, my question is, Ambedkar puts a point, speaks about moral equality. And he particularly writes, emphasis must be placed on the term moral. So you spoke about spiritual equality, sir. So what is the relevance of moral equality in the spiritual?
Well, Ambedkar, when he talked about moral equality, he meant a combination of morality. He was very much aware of the spiritual morality, the social morality, the political morality and legal morality. For example, constitutional morality. A lawyer or a judge would talk about constitutional morality. But without a spiritual morality, any constitutional morality is absolutely meaningless. So, I just gave a talk to lawyers and law students 3 days back. Unless those who believe in religion and God begin to create a moral basis that God created all human beings equal, then the social morality does not become strong. So that is where Ambedkar went back to Gautam Buddha, constructed spiritual morality from him, then came to social morality of several reformers, then finally political morality of thinkers and constitutional morality. So Ambedkar is not a very unilinear thinker. To me, he has combined these four moralities into larger moral values. We need to stress on that now. Yeah.
Next. Thank you, sir. Next question is from Dhanendra Kumari HR. Dhanendra Kumari HR, please raise your question.
Yeah, it is still muted, unmuted.
Are you there?
Dhanendra Kumari.
Alright, I think there is any technical glitch. We can go.
There is a problem there.
The next question is from Akshita. Akshita, please ask your question.
Yeah, please. Where is Akshita then?
Akshita, please ask your question.
If she is not there, Krishna Raj Iyer is there also.
Alright, so next question has been put out to us through the chat box from Chris Dio Jensen from University of Manila. The question is, recent excavations in Kiradi and Kiradi excavations and in the Harappan DNA test have showed out towards the Aryan invasion theory. So what holds next to the legitimization of Aryan migration theory in recent context of Kiradi excavations and the DNA test at Harappa?
Well, see, a lot of studies are coming on this, and the best book that all of you should read is Tony Joseph's Early Indians. And what Tony Joseph says is that after the third Aryan migration, when the migrations were still taking place because of violent ruptures or wars or even natural disasters or whatever, the Harappans who migrated from Maharashtra via Karnataka to Kerala, Tamil Nadu, had settled down there. And my feeling is several of them migrated to Andhra and Telangana also, Krishna Godavari belt. And if you see the tribals on Krishna Godavari rivers and the names, for example, Harappa and Veerappa. There's a god called Veerappa in our area, very, very popular. So Harappa was a human name given to the city at that time, and a lot of migrations took place to Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and the Dravidian population shows more of Indo-African blood formations. So the new studies are telling us that the early civilization was built by Indo-Africans, and it was through animal domestication, agriculture building. Recently, there is a study that says that there was advanced dairy development, milk and maybe curd and so on, things must have been formed. But this in between, during the Vedic period, what is known as rural economy, all that development has been pushed backward. So the city civilization went into forests again. So only with Patliputra and maybe in the south, we had built some cities, but concrete studies have to come out. Some of you must really take up. I have done several articles on Harappan culture, how villages must have been built, how domestications were done. And there is a book review of mine of Tony Joseph in Mainstream called Early India Goats and Brahmins. You can see that on Google. So we need to do a lot of studies around these things. I'm glad you asked this question.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Sanjay R. Sanjay R. Sorry, not Sanjay R. Sandeep Harshan. Sandeep Harshan, please ask your question.
Okay, sir. I'm a teacher from Kerala. Sir, it's actually about the. Am I audible to you? Hello? Am I audible?
Sir, you have muted yourself. Sir, please unmute.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. You are
Sir,
audible.
yeah. Okay, so this is about when we talk about the voice of the repressed and the dissent, and we always believe that there should be dissent when it comes to a democracy. But what happens most of the time is that you have people have, especially the repressed people, so-called marginalized people, have no voice, and we are providing them no space for the voice to be raised. So, how far would you be thinking that English language would help them to open up their voices? So, I'm trying to ask you this on the context is like, most of the time, recently we have developed a tendency towards promoting the vernacular language at the cost of English, and suddenly people and politicians appear to have a sort of awareness towards the English language, and they are trying to raise this promote this vernacular languages at the cost of English language. So, what's your take on that, sir? Is there a tendency?
So my feeling is that unless every individual has an access to a national language in any nation, for example, in China, it is the Chinese one language from one end to another. In Germany, German language as a national language, one language. Everybody knows that. There may be, or in Italy or England. So English nations are different. They are multinational languages. But India is only country where fragmentation of languages within a small state, again tribals, again some religious minorities speak different. My feeling is the state governments must make every government school two-language education system. English as essential medium of instruction, because English should become Indian national language in the next 25 years, so that every child born today would be able to speak, read and write in English, and then to address the regional issues, they should be able to read and write and speak in local regional language. So For example, Andhra Pradesh started teaching in English medium in the government schools. The battle is in the courts. I was speaking to Kerala Chief Minister, asking him to start English medium in government schools, but the communists are very adamant regional languages. But their children they put in English medium, all leaders. That is the hypocrisy part. So all young students like you and others must start a campaign that English is Indian now. Every child should study in English medium as a national language. Then they should compulsorily study in public and private schools one subject in regional language. Compulsory, whether it's public school or private school. So that's why we need to build two-language formula. But English dimension is the larger. I've been writing about it for the last 30 years. Now it is catching up, and over a period of time it will become an issue of election. Whoever promises English medium in government schools will get elected. And naturally it is election policy. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Next question has been asked to us through the chat by Jake Isaac from London School of Economics. His question is, we have seen a change of regimes from ancien regime to new regime with democratic setup in French Revolution. And also we have seen how dialectical stages of communist order by Karl Marx have pointed out towards a Marxist conception of history where there will be a communist world after a socialist and capitalist world. And also Noam Chomsky puts out that anarchist order should be the essential order of governance. And Fukuyama points out at liberal democracy as the future of world order. So sir, his question is, what holds next in future for governance and political framework?
I see that Marx and Hegel and then pre-Hegelian thinkers like Rousseau, Locke, and so on. They evolved democracy at one level. Marx evolved a socialist model at another level. But after the concrete classical socialism proving to be ineffective in the practice, there is a lot of mixation of liberal democracy with Marxist welfarism. If you look at Britain, the fact that entire health system is in the state sector, old don't have to bother about health, and the entire education system is in the state sector, is nothing but an effective combination of Marxian state management of life with that of liberal democracy and capitalist mode of free market. So I would assume that after this pandemic, there is going to be a new technology and information revolution. Today, we don't have to travel to give this kind of speech to England. From sitting here, we can address several university students. So technology and communications will combine Marxism and liberalism into a future hybrid egalitarianism with many freedoms. Now, not that it will not allow struggles or there is less scope for violence. Violence role comes down in a way, though we can see terrorism happening, we can see black people getting killed, or in India, a lot of violence on women, or Dalits and so on. So over a period of time, to me it appears new vibrant theories will come. And the future should be from India and China of new theories. China is experimenting a new brand of socialism with a massive population, of course with good land size. India is experimenting back and forth with democracy elections with massive population, with very small land, 1/3 of Chinese land, and right wing, left wing, middle, though Indian communists have destroyed themselves. But I think a new hope only when a nation like India speaks English, one language, a lot of thinkers will come from nooks and corners of the world. A day will come that the whole world will speak one language. It was prophetically said long time back, world may speak one language one day in the spiritual domain. But in my view, that's going to happen near future. So let us see the Fukuyama thesis that there is end of history is not going to happen. History is going to march further and further. Thank you. Next.
Thank you, sir. This is a question from Philip, who is a Rhodes Scholar from Oxford University. His question is, the Constitution of India essentially guarantees principles of social justice and equality. Any policy or any governmental action that has to be taken must be in consonance with these principles or values. Yet, how is that most of the time suppressive or repressive policies, laws, and practices against the Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi people end up circumventing such provisions that are inherent in the Constitution?
Well, the theory of social justice in India is based on a very weak premise. The better premise was worked out by Ambedkar, though Amartya Sen tried to write a book on social justice without even debating on caste system, which is a wrong premise and wrong way of presenting India to the world. You know, he at length talks about Ashoka, talks about Akbar, and then welfare systems emerging and so on. But how does Amartya Sen presume that when there are Brahmins, Banyas, Kayasthas, Khatris, he himself is a Kayastha, when there is concrete caste system which is an antithetical system for social justice, he doesn't talk about abolition of caste. Now that's a very paradox to me. I read that book and I reviewed also. You can type in Google Panchayalay's review on Amartya Sen's social justice book. So the question is, the caste and Hindu spiritual system, when are treating food producers, meat and milk economists, and shoemakers, subaltern scientists, what I call, all of them as polluted or weak, and sociology theories writing them as pollution, beef being talked as pollution. Now this kind of a theory does not allow social justice to operate on rational ground. All Brahmin intellectuals from JNU, Delhi University, go abroad, study abroad, and come back and behave like Brahmins within India. They never recognize caste. They never accept its existence. See, if an intellectual denies the existence of an institutional reality, he is not an intellectual. He is a hypocrite. All these economists who are getting some Nobel Prize or the other sitting in other countries without recognizing the basic structural institutional operations, not telling them about, not finding out ways and means to abolish wrong institutions and build new institutions. Social science cannot advance from India. So my feeling is that as of now, there is some foundational principle laid by Ambedkar for social justice theory. During Mandal period, there was a fundamental discourse around it, but we need to advance it with a much more inclusive thought, much better than Amartya Sen and other. See, so long as this Brahmin Banya Kayasthas write these theories, they will not be creative. They may get awards, that's a different. But they will not be creative, they will not be transforming, they will not be liberating. So therefore my idea is the SC, ST, OBCs, the Adivasis and so on, from the villages should come with a strong English educational base and write new theories from villages, grounds, because every village is a knowledge center. So I think some of you who are studying abroad in Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge must realize this and then make village knowledge. Please read my book Post-Hindu India, and my new book called The Shudras, Vision for a New Path is coming out by February. It is being published by Penguin. It is edited book by young scholars. I edited it. You will see what kind of new ideas come in that. The whole category of Shudra is repositioned now vis-a-vis Dvijas. I think from there social justice theory will come out very strong. Okay, next.
Now, the final question is from Akshita from Ramjas College, Delhi University. Her question is, sir, you have made a statement that pandemics have become a source of using authoritarian power on masses in the cases of India. This holds true in light of the recent clampdowns on activists and so on. At the same time, in Bolivia, has the pandemic acted as an agent in ending the authoritarian rule and handing the power back to the masses? So what is your take on the same?
Well, unfortunately in India, some of these most suffering masses like, migrant labor or the kind of rapes that are taking place in UP and the kind of power that is being used. In the pandemic is deepening the roots of authoritarianism. At the same time, when pandemic is very aggressive in USA, the black rebellions are massive. They are not afraid of death there. So in India, situation somehow is different. Now why, I don't know. Is it because of the weak opposition here? Is it because of the muzzling capacity of the ruling forces? But the protest movements here are very weak. In other countries, even in England, for example, a lot of churning happened during pandemic. Bolivia, you are giving the example. You are right. Even in Latin American countries. So I was also surprised why pandemic could be so easily used by the ruling regimes, particularly Indian regime, and also even the Muslim world. We don't see a single voice from there. Things are very bad. And some of the African countries, there is churning. So I think the youth must take a clue to reposition the consciousness I'm not saying that street fight alone is the issue or the solution. But mobilization, theorization, writing, and using pandemics for reading more and more new books and writing new things, opening up new platforms should have happened in India. But unfortunately, it is not. So I'm also a bit surprised. I'm glad you asked this question.
Thank you, sir. With this, we come to the end of question answer session. Now I give the floor to Meenakshi for delivering the word of thanks, after which we'll come to a close. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for this very informative and very thought-provoking session. Your words have been of immense value and I think have broadened all our minds with respect to this topic. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all the participants who've joined today's program and for being very active in voicing all your opinions. I would also like to thank Nauticum's event management's team members, the social media team for their constant posts, the organizational teams that have looked into the platforms for this webinar and who've helped ensure a smooth functioning of this event. Once again, I thank all of your attendance for this 6th session of The Secret of the Webinars. For more information with regard to the webinar series, please look or go on our Instagram page, nauticums.official. We look forward to seeing you all in the future sessions.